Okay, so we'll get started now. Welcome, everybody. I'm Keith Crumwoody, Dean of Architecture at California College of the Arts. Thanks for joining us today for this lecture by Ersela Krippa and Stephen Mueller of Agency. At CCA, we understand land acknowledgement as a transformative act meant to confront our place on native lands and to build mindfulness of our present participation in colonial legacies. California College of the Arts campuses are located in Huichin and Yelamu, also known as Oakland and San Francisco, respectively, on the unceded territories of Chochenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who have continuously lived upon this land since time immemorial. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon indigenous peoples in California and the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands and the deliberate and systematic destruction of their communities and culture. CCA honors indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, here and around the world, and we wish to pay respect to local elders, including those of the lands from which you're joining us virtually today. This is an important year for CCA architecture. We're celebrating 100 years of interior design and architectural education as our BFA interior design program marks its 50th anniversary, our Bachelor of Architecture program its 35th, and our Master of Architecture program its 15th. And with our lecture series, Remaking, we're bringing important thinkers and makers to CCA to reflect upon the work we must do now, both here at the school and in the discipline at large, to remake architecture and co-imagine a just and equitable future. Ersela and Stephen are two such people. But before I introduce them, I'd like to tell you about the next event in the series. On March 12th at noon, Professor Catherine Bakos will convene a panel discussion with industry leaders exploring work that she's been pursuing with students for several years now about the future of work. You can find the full series schedule, along with stories by and about our students, faculty, and alumni at scaffold.architecture.cca.edu. And now to the main event. It's my great pleasure tonight to welcome Ersela and Stephen to CCA. They are faculty members at Texas Tech College of Architecture, El Paso, alma mater of many of our MArch students over the years, for which we are most thankful, and many of those students are here with us tonight. They're also founding partners of Agency, a design and research practice which leverages spatial design and spatial information to counteract nascent forms of global and urban insecurity. From its position on the US-Mexico border, the work of Agency reveals and enacts emerging publics. Working in protracted, conflictual context, the practice consistently shifts the narrative, developing targeted methods to identify, appropriate, and subvert sub-perceptual urban and atmospheric events that violate human rights. Agency's work has been exhibited internationally, including at the Hong Kong Shenzhen Bi-City Biennale for Architecture, the Venice Biennale, the Berlin Biennale, Storefront for Art and Architecture in New York, and the Richmond Art Center. Ersela is an associate professor and acting director at Texas Tech College of Architecture, El Paso, and director of projects at POST, the Project for Post-Operative Spatial Technologies, a College of Architecture research center. Stephen is a research assistant professor at Texas Tech University's College of Architecture and director of research at POST. Both are recipients of the Rome Prize in Architecture and the Emerging Voices Award from the Architectural League of New York, and both hold Master of Science in Advanced Architectural Design degrees from Columbia's GSAT. Last year, they published the important work Fronts, Military Urbanisms for the Developing World, a book which compiles original urban research and analysis that reveals a growing geography of codependence between the global security complex and the urban morphologies of the developing world, which it increasingly incriminates. Fronts is a dazzling display of committed and dogged research into the relationship between ideology and space. As a kind of post-occupancy report on the recent and rapid militarization of urban space worldwide, Fronts provides us with a close reading of the machinations of power and space. Across its pages, Kripa and Mueller survey histories and installations, scrutinize manuals and protocols, speculate on the consequences of these sites and operations, and synthesize their research in precise and provocative drawings and careful prose. In so doing, it makes exceedingly evident that if we are to imagine other ways things might be, we must first see them freshly for what they are. As you might be able to tell, I'm a huge fan of both Ersela and Stephen. Both are brilliant teachers, inspired researchers, and fantastic architects. They are also wonderful humans, and I feel lucky to call them my friends. Please join me in welcoming Ersela Krippa and Stephen Mueller to CCA.
Wow, thank you. That was
Thank
so
you.
nice. We are honored to call you our friend. Here we are. I'm sharing my screen. We will present some collection of work today, both research and projects. And thank you all for joining us tonight. And thank you, Keith and CCA, for inviting us, and Sarah for sort of making this happen technically. So we are also excited to be part of this lecture series that you're titling Remaking, because we feel many affinities with our work. And as Keith mentioned, we're researchers and designers, and we embrace confrontational roles in order to create objects, forms, spaces, databases, and arguments which instrumentalize spatial justice. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out the slides. Whoops, sorry. Okay, here we go. There we are. And so today we're going to present a series of 3 investigations that are paired with 3 projects. And then we'll leave you with a small glimpse of our recently published book that Keith just mentioned. This is our context you see here on the US-Mexico border. It is defined by the border, but also the atmosphere is shared, and the ecologies are undefined by it. So working in this kind of context, we are interested in shifting the narrative and developing targeted methods to identify, appropriate, and subvert sub-perceptual urban and atmospheric events that violate human rights. This is the militarized landscape of the borderland, and it's really our office and our reason for being here in order to enact alternatives to this kind of damaging and divisive use of infrastructure. This is our daily commute to the office and to the school, driving along the international border fence that you see here. After the Secure Fence Act of 2006, about 57 miles of border fence were completed by 2008, mostly along the channelized Rio Grande, Rio Bravo, which serves as the international boundary. And here you see glimpses through the natural landscape as Border Patrol agents actually enter and exit this no man's land. You'll see in a few seconds, there's a new highway that was constructed that straddles the border fence. You see its legs here, the columns. And then this really allows commuters to hover above the no man's land between the fence and the river, which is a really interesting situation for us. And it's common around this area to see Border Patrol apprehensions as migrants who actually make it past the fence are really facing impassable infrastructural barriers, as you see these kind of layers of inaccessibility. And so here, after you see the highway, on the left is our College of Architecture in the historic Daniel Burnham train station, which still functions. And so from these sort of infrastructural layers, this is where kind of we invite you to imagine the context of the work and the way of thinking.
So we'll start now with presenting the investigations and the projects. You'll see as we move through the presentation that we wear a lot of different hats, as Keith mentioned, as educators, as researchers, as architects. For this first investigation, you'll see that we're actually acting more like investigative journalists. This is for our Border Dispatches series for Architects newspaper, where over the past several years, we've been really trying to track the changes in the borderland, especially in the built environment of the borderland, especially given the changes since the last presidential election. Here we've documented a number of things. You can see just a small selection here, including the proliferation of simulated sites, like simulated border fences that help to train Customs and Border Patrol, Customs and Border Protection and Border Patrol operatives in the use of lethal force in and around and through the international fence. Also new types of control in the second example here, where distributed infrastructures and sensing technologies actually allow for a kind of unmanned border checkpoint. And in the last example here, documenting the growing privatization of the detention industry, which corresponds greatly with sites of imprisonment and kind of carceral technologies. One of these investigative texts we'll focus on here revealed the growing number of construction technology patents that were enabled as a result of the construction of the border wall prototype. So you might remember construction companies constructed these mock-ups of border walls in 2017 to vie for the government contract to install hundreds of miles of Trump's new border barriers. We did some digging into the design history of this moment and found that many of the companies involved in the mock-ups were actually applying for patents for the technology that they developed for the border wall, and some of those are shown here. One particular patent for a steel bollard fence designed by Fisher Industries, we uncovered and illustrated in the article. It was piloted just outside of El Paso last summer, actually, and part of that drive to our work in school that you just saw. The construction of that pilot project has since enabled the rapid construction of miles of border wall through really environmentally sensitive areas, through indigenous lands, and it's contributing to an ongoing and lethal humanitarian crisis at the border, where migrants continue to seek alternative paths around the fence through more dangerous and deadly terrain because of this type of construction. This is the section of wall that was piloted in El Paso, built in a few weeks using that patented technology. It was built without an environmental impact study, and its construction disturbed some highly polluted soil, which will likely reach the Rio Grande River in the front of this image. That's a huge problem for this area because people depend on the river for drinking water and for irrigation, people both on the US and Mexican side. And since that project and since this article, we've seen this technology continue to be deployed across the borderland with damaging effects on ecologies, on landscapes, and on human life. Our article alerted the architectural community, the readership of Architect's newspaper, to avoid this new building technique and to not be tempted by the promises of the patent to build faster, cheaper, and better simultaneously. And to avoid this technology that was developed at such environmental and human cost.
And so by kind of broadcasting this sort of work and the infrastructures of the border, we were contacted by Amnesty International, who were working on a report during the COVID-19 crisis on migrant detention centers. And so we worked with them last summer in order to visualize the dangers and overcrowding and mismanagement of federal and private immigration detention facilities, which has contributed to disproportionate rates of COVID-19 infections in that population. So using documents that Amnesty obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, we geolocated and categorized 200 federally operated immigration detention facilities in the US, and some of them are also privately managed. And we visualized their average detainee population versus their capacity, highlighting overcrowding and that this was incredibly dangerous at the height of the pandemic, and it continues to be so. So our interactive web map, which is online, of these facilities summarizes the findings in these kind of graphic overlays while providing searchable and zoomable facility level data in support of the Amnesty report. In the online map, one can actually zoom, like you see here on the right, close enough, and a layer of aerial images shows the physical and physical properties and architecture of these buildings. The overcrowding is especially a problem, as I said, just for the spreading of COVID-19, but also this immigrant population that is being detained is particularly vulnerable in sort of layered ways. So the report with our maps and the original photographs you see here from our own visits in these detention centers to the right were used to advocate for the release of migrant detainees from detention and promoting a kind of a waiting period while the processing was happening outside of the detention centers. And this is, we're sort of, if you've noticed, we're alternating between research and projects. So this is a kind of a research piece. There's a recent initiative that we've taken on that merges our kind of investigative territorial work with the design research here at Texas Tech, specifically in the Project for Operative Spatial Technologies, which is POST, the research center that was mentioned. And this looks at urbanization and desertification at the US-Mexico border. Shifting patterns of ultraviolet exposure in North America are mapping very closely to essentially matching the international border with high intensities of UV exposure, even in winter months. And this is actually intensifying our southern boundary. The 30th parallel, which crosses the borderland, becomes a charged exposure boundary. With the effects of climate change and population below this boundary, these populations will actually start to see increased risk of sunburn and other negative health effects related to UV exposure. The lack of shade in the borderland, as you see here, we're in the high desert, and the amount of atmospheric scattering due to dust increases the health risk to individuals. But at the same time, the national security apparatus has become expert at deploying tactical infrastructures that mitigate the impact of ultraviolet radiation on its agents in order to inspect and manage other bodies more efficiently. And building on these tactical interventions, the federal border security apparatus has developed an appetite for shade in the borderland and has continued to invest in more permanent, purpose-built structures in order to extend their cover and to strengthen their position in the landscape, resulting in an extensive inventory of shade structures serving the security state. But at ports of entries, shade becomes a national security concern. When screening technologies, also like license plate readers and radiation monitors, are not protected by shade, they can overheat and fail to operate, and therefore it becomes a sort of a much larger issue for governmental oversight. But the highly securitized El Paso Ciudad Juarez Metroplex is, as being one of the largest binational urban environments in the Western Hemisphere, is really exposed to solar radiation relentlessly. And this is mostly rendered upon the vulnerable populations. So while we have a shade surplus in the security apparatus, we have a shade deficit in the vulnerable populations that actually need it. This Metroplex is host to some of the most traveled international pedestrian bridges between the US and Mexico, and especially here it connects the two downtowns. So within the increasingly austere and securitized public spaces of the border zone, pedestrians are subjected to high levels of solar radiation on daily cross-border commutes. And as being in a desert city that's subject to unparalleled geopolitical and environmental stresses, access to shade is what Sam Bloch has described as an index of inequality. And you probably followed 2 years ago, Central American migrants and asylum seekers were detained in makeshift shade structures under bridges, as you see here in these tents, that were just not adequate to protect them against prolonged UV damage. And so this image made it through the news media as this kind of inequality of shade protection.
So the design research that's tied to these concerns now in the research center is a project that we call irradiated shade. And so through the research center, we've been developing shade surplus and shade deficit maps, and also shade maps of irradiated shade within maps of public space in the borderland. The borderland is a tricky place to map anything because the international boundary provides this kind of hard edge to data. And so we're using remote sensing and computational analysis to kind of fill some of those gaps across the data divide. To identify sites at particular risk to ultraviolet exposure, we're developing computational workflows and representational strategies to assess shade designs from a perspective of ultraviolet radiation. So here you can see just mapping diffuse solar radiation with some of these tools. We can start to see some of the asymmetrical distribution of UV protection. So the relatively low amounts of diffuse solar radiation shown in the yellow here actually occur closer to the urban core at the top left of the image. The international boundary is the curving river sort of through the middle here. And these are areas with lots of vegetation, high slope, and some other shade structures provided. But as you approach the border and the international bridges, the exposure index increases. So there's huge swaths of the urban core with high exposure to diffuse radiation, and this covers some of the lowest income zip codes in the city and actually in the US, signaling that access to urban UV protection is actually an under-considered condition of environmental inequality. We also use LiDAR point cloud data to get kind of a closer read on how the physical fabric of the city impacts some of these conditions. And through this, we can better understand the distribution at sort of the block level and the building scale. In this area, in this image, we see higher protection in and around the urban core. And then in this next image, you can see the kind of the lower rise area near the international boundary because of this is also overexposed. So then to develop something from the perspective of the radiation that we as designers and other designers can use, we borrow on some of the kind of hidden logics that help to make those last images in GIS software. And we develop our own tools in 3D environments in order to visualize and assess the condition of solar radiation, moving into a more kind of immediate design and drawing environment. So to better understand the impact of building geometry on UV exposure, we developed this algorithm that spherically projects sky exposure based on a kind of given urban context. So it pulls the somewhat hidden logic of the GIS calculations into these kind of three-dimensional models and drawings. We've been deploying this algorithm at the highly trafficked intersections in the borderland in order to understand the different degrees of exposure to the sky of each intersection, and therefore the amount of diffuse radiation and damage from UVB that pedestrians face. Each intersection kind of has its own signature, yielding this different and highly articulated sky exposure map around the sphere, which we can use as a kind of computable surface. So we take data from the surface area, for instance, to make a kind of broad assessment of the amount of sky that's visible. Basically, the more sky that's visible, no matter if a condition is in shade or out of shade, the more sky that you can see from any position renders more UV in that position. So we can understand that from these images. We're continuing to develop the interface and the outputs from this tool set, and we're integrating an ability to better visualize and assess the relationship of sky exposure to solar orientations. Here we're looking at ways to integrate the sky dome geometry with other environmental analysis tools through things like Grasshopper and Ladybug to map monthly averages and sort of times of day that might be particularly dangerous for pedestrians passing through this kind of unseen and unknowable condition of being radiated, even though they might be in a condition of shade. And to make maybe a more intuitive mapping, we're also unrolling this kind of spherical projection into these kinds of drawings, these panoramas that allow us to see the particular geometry of the skyline from any point in the city. So that we can begin to assess and address these overexposed conditions by placing protective shade structures in order to block the amount of exposed and visible sky. We've sampled every major pedestrian intersection of our borderland, at least, our metroplex, to compile this sky exposure catalog. And we can color code each by their degree of exposure, so we can graphically identify the areas at highest risk. And we've begun to explore possible forms for shade structure, a kind of didactic shade pavilion to combat the effects of UVB scatter, which will need to cover a large area while selectively masking the sky that's exposed. And we see this as just the beginning of developing an ability to address the kind of biopolitics that you just heard about that are enmeshed in ultraviolet exposure and provision of shade in the borderland. We see increasingly the vulnerable populations are exposed to high levels of UV and its damaging effects. We're discussing this project now with project partners. We hope to have an intervention at least mapped out in augmented reality by the end of the spring. We're working with our research assistants in the center to sort of land a kind of didactic shade structure on site to serve some people in need in our community. So the next sort of research agenda here involves more sort of atmospheric effects, especially around dust. So our work seeks to forge identities and promote dialogue across real and imagined boundaries, as you've seen. But another vector that's instrumental to our work here is this conception of kind of transboundary atmospheres. We have a number of dynamic and often highly polluted airsheds in our region that span the border that co-produce complex environmental effects with transboundary populations and binational urban centers. Our context here is defined and controlled by these layered jurisdictional borders where infrastructures delineate local and regional areas while the atmosphere transgresses them. This region, and we're actually entering it now, has a dusty season where particulate matter is pushed across the international border and other jurisdictional borders, problematizing environmental monitoring and endangering public health. And despite our shared air basin and the shared problems that we face with our neighbors, the kind of jurisdictional fragmentation of multiple states, cities, and counties in the region obscures the common issues within our kind of collectively urbanized valley. Atmospheric inversions, together with the colors of the high desert sunset, make some of these effects visible, like the ecological distress that this region is suffering. So we do witness it occasionally in conditions like these that can last for days throughout the spring. So the jurisdictions that monitor atmospheric conditions, like their terrestrial counterparts, are defined by borderlines. So while some atmospheric administrative borderlines are drawn to coincide with and therefore reinforce existing geopolitical constructs like national borders, others intentionally remap the territories below to make more of kind of an airshed boundary irrespective of cities or states. So we're developing this critical cartography of aerial territories that reveals competing attitudes of contemporary airsheds to the jurisdictions that they help to forge or subvert. The first scale we're looking at this is through the national and international lens. So here we uncover an air monitoring regime that actually reinforces the national border. The travel of particulate and dust into and within the US has actually long been and considered an existential threat to our national security. One example of this, since 2003, a program called BioWatch, which is a national biosurveillance program, enlists federal authorities in the US and air monitor stations in secretive locations throughout a number of cities, including border cities. Every day, a large team of public health officials test samples of inbound air and scans for microscopic airborne threats to national airspace. And while the precise geography of this BioWatch program is a closely guarded national secret, we've been able to mine kind of public reports and cobble together sort of likely locations and likely cities that are part of this regime. At the next scale, we also explore the many multi-jurisdictional atmospheric administrative constructs within our national airspace, which assemble otherwise disjointed state and county authorities in the service of shared environmental action. So here we have airsheds around metropolitan areas that might cross state or county lines. So as these aerial territories consolidate and compound, they form entirely new geographies beyond the limits of traditionally conceived urban extents, created what we can describe only as airshed megaregions, which forge new administrative and political collectives. Several of these, and you see them here, cross state lines, and the majority of these involve maybe 2 neighboring states, but there are several tri-state and even more states involved, regions that involve up to 4 adjacent states. So as urbanization and sprawl continue to blur the lines between a kind of city and its larger political construct, these urban forms extend into extensive megacities, city regions, mega regions, and there's really a similar phenomenon sort of in the sky that's visible now in the chains of adjacent multi-state environmental control regions. So now that we've seen these 2 scales of different geographies of atmospheric assessment, the national and the sort of metropolitan, we can understand now how they apply both in our region. So in the Paso del Norte region, where we live, these 2 atmospheric constructs exist kind of simultaneously, and they produce what we think is a hyperbolically atomized transnational air basin amidst significant environmental, urban, and demographic transformations. So our airshed spans and subverts the boundaries of multiple national, state, and binational jurisdictions in a complex overlaid patchwork. Environmental and atmospheric management in our region has to contend with 2 countries, the US and Mexico, 3 states, New Mexico, Texas, and Chihuahua, and 2 cities, El Paso and Ciudad Juarez. And there's asymmetries in reporting frequencies and environmental standards and protocols, systems of measurement at a number of scales and a number of levels of administration that yield divided, disjointed, and discontinuous data sets. So we're trying to build our own that can cross these boundaries. We seek to better understand the effectiveness of these monitoring jurisdictions for the populations they're meant to serve in order to find discrepancies between discontiguous airsheds and contiguous populations. So here we're assessing the location and reach of different air quality monitors throughout the borderland in our region and beyond. Each sensor monitors a different scale of the atmosphere and so has a different kind of caliber of resolution. By extrapolating the range of the environmental sensors and the sensor networks themselves, we can start to assess a density of monitoring and a scale of resolution, basically what areas of the country actually have a good read on environmental atmospheric threats to public health and other issues. And we find that there's actually significant disparities in the investment and the resolution throughout the increasingly urbanized borderland. And we call these the blind spots in the atmospheric sensing regime, the dark spots on this map that you see collecting along the border, which leave underrepresented atmospheres and populations at risk beyond the kind of capability of the monitors to assess the condition. So in our practice, which you'll see here in a second, we design interventions and other forms of representation to start to address these kinds of environmental justice issues in the region. And we work with sensing technology and other tools to do that.
And so you see here, we've developed a really extensive collection of sensors and sort of DIY based on Arduino, essentially. So this project responds to these much larger atmospheric kind of jurisdictional issues with a very, very small scale specific type of intervention. As Stephen has been showing these maps, we live in a binational kind of desert region that is shared by the Chihuahuan Desert. So the Chihuahuan Desert obviously transcends the border boundary, but it also defines the shared geology of the area beyond the specific political boundary line, which then problematizes sharing of data. About 40 minutes south of the border are the Samalayuca desert sands that are they're made of silica essentially, which makes it highly airborne and a really light kind of particulate, which also kind of contributes to this sort of airborne particulate density in the region. And during springtime, most areas of the nation are really excited for spring. Actually, our springtime is mostly a dusty season. And you see here in purple through kind of satellite imagery that is actually a dust storm brewing exactly where our region is. It's not a sort of a wet storm. And so there are times where the entire kind of all of the jurisdictions are completely erased by this enormous dust cloud that hovers over us, further kind of reinforcing the point of these kind of fragmented jurisdictions that they seem to be archaic or draconian. Here's a closer view of the Samalayuca sort of sand dunes with this kind of fine particulate matter that also compounds the urbanization in the area. And compounded with that, or added to the sort of the dry season kind of wind storms, we also get the smaller dust devils that are kind of essentially kicked up from automobiles or people walking the fields. So there's always an opportunity to be exposed to dust. On the southern side of the border in Juarez, a specific community in Anapra is essentially self-settled following the construction or the proliferation of maquiladoras, especially after the NAFTA agreement. And a lot of these communities have been completely disregarded and neglected in terms of infrastructural development. So a lot of the dust and the sand that you see that's of the desert makes it into the homes and into people's lungs. And particularly this region, while we do have air quality monitoring stations, these stations generally tend to average their readings, and therefore through the yearly and the regional average, they don't actually show the specificity of air pollution and sort of the dust particulate matter in the region. And as Stephen was describing through the videos, we also are in a valley surrounded, both cities are in valleys surrounded by mountains on north and south sides of the border, and that contributes to atmospheric inversions, which end up keeping the dust layer trapped during the night, and it never makes it out into the atmosphere. And so there's also a sort of a layering of dust, and you see here through this kind of infrastructural neglect, it adds to the atmosphere. So the project that we call nephelometry is essentially a sensor, a sort of DIY sensing project. We called upon volunteers, and these are some of the volunteer homes in Juarez who decided to host sensors for a few weeks. And also on the north side of the border, we installed them ourselves in El Paso. And the idea was to be able to kind of the project actually works at all scales. It works at this kind of 3D printing, really sort of rough digital fabrication idea where we're securely packing the dust sensors that you see here on the left into empty surveillance camera bodies, because the surveillance cameras are so ubiquitous that they would be less suspicious if they showed up than if you saw the sensors. And so we were creating these kind of flexible packing techniques. And then also on the Juarez side, because there are so many sort of electrical junction boxes at many private homes, we hacked those as well. And so the sensor bundle was hidden in the electrical junction boxes and kind of left in people's backyards and rooms. So we conducted studies for aerodynamics to ensure that there is accurate reading while in the housing of the camera. And what we do a lot of is to also broadcast the findings of the project in exhibitions and publications, and they become, in this way, public awareness campaigns. So the end of the project was exhibited at the Rubin Center here in El Paso at this gallery, along with Ron Ryle's work and Ivan Puig from Mexico. And so this was about sort of transnational ecologies. And so when we take the readings from all of the sensors and we overlap them with atmospheric pressure and wind data from the El Paso airport, we were able to create these kinds of maps where, here you see, I'm going to play this, a visualization on a digital, accurate sort of topographic digital model of the region. And you see the dust sensors as the source points here overlapped with wind. This is clearly sped up for this presentation, but the idea is to not only look at the moments of, or the points where the sensors are, but to start to understand the layering over time with the shifting of wind directions, and to create this kind of aesthetic that is a lot more approachable and understandable, almost like a weather map. So the hope is that if we hyper localize the reading of pollution, then citizens are actually empowered with their own information in order to kind of to really enact policy. And at a much smaller scale, we're also interested in scanning these small dust plumes and dust devil events and understanding their geometry as a way to perhaps develop this with an app that actually reads the severity of the particulate matter in the air. So the drawings became these kind of community drawings where each home and each volunteer who was able to measure and take back the data and understand it in their own locality, but also was able to sort of draw this communal blurred boundary of the border. And you can see here daily and hourly as winds shift, the binational line doesn't really make sense, that these other kind of flows are more important. And the hope is to advocate for policy change at the local level on both sides of the border.
So we'll just end now with a quick preview, I guess, of our book, and explain this research and how it's kind of coalesced for us over the last, I think this is probably now a 6 or 8 year project, captured in these 300 some odd pages. So from these kind of local and regional frontiers that we're invested in here in our context, the book really zooms out to more of a global scale and tries to understand the ways in which the built environment is being shaped by security forces in a multitude of sites. This book collects our original research, our writing, our mappings, and our speculative drawings that concern the many fronts, what we call the fronts that we see impacting global cities. From our current location, we've been able to document how the US military constructs these fronts. Here you see just a little bit up the road from where we are now, training in progress at a simulated city used for urban warfare training with a tank kind of crossing the desert. The sites that we document in the book, the fronts we suggest, are these different kinds of global and transnational spaces. They're new constellations of cities and city-like forms, urban patterns that are developed from the agonistic interchange of security on one hand and development on the other. Although its constituent parts might be geographically distant, the front, we suggest, is bound and shaped by a set of common characteristics. The book uncovers a particular geography, this geography of secretive simulated cities that are built on military installations in order to train combat troops in urban warfare. We've scraped a rather disjointed public record of including congressional hearings and appropriations, as well as military construction budgets in order to find and locate these sites. And through that research, we were able to identify and geolocate and document over 500 of these sites worldwide. What we found through this kind of comparative analysis of these sites is that these simulated urban environments, the kind of city combat training sites, are becoming themselves more and more urban in character. They're more city-like. As the sites and the trainers on the sites attempt to increase the realism to effectively train troops for the use of lethal force in dense urban environments, the military is now developing its own extensive urban inventory. And this is a kind of shadow urbanism that's starting to achieve a density and a variety of buildings and infrastructures that really rapidly approach the diversity and the intensity of real world cities. The sites are kind of stand-ins for city forms that militaries seek to dominate. They're excerpts of different aspects of global urbanism. While the sites themselves are becoming more urban, the opposite is also true. So real cities are becoming training sites themselves. And real cities are increasingly used to simulate the fabric of a future urbanized war. In one example, just a little further down the road here in Playas, New Mexico, this is an abandoned town that was abandoned after the copper industry failed in the region. Here you see the pattern of suburban homes that were left behind, but around the suburban homes, you can see these kind of artificial compound walls that are meant to simulate Afghan compounds. And also towards the bottom of the image, you see a kind of new urbanization of a so-called main street along one of the suburban roads, where now it's turned into a kind of, it first was a Middle Eastern sort of main street market, and now is a North African market.
And so the book dives deep into one particular simulated city form, the Combined Arms Collective Training Facility, or the CACTF as they call it. This is the gold standard for urban warfare training, where infantry, tanks, and air operations can be simultaneously deployed. We've located over 30 of these facilities and can learn a lot about the military's posture towards urban environment from deep analysis and their architectural and urban forms. So this CACTF typology mandates the replication of certain urban and architectural typologies that you see here. So we've identified through these 6 spatial types that are common to the developing world, commonly simulated in these and other sites. So we have the camp, the zone, the dump, the graveyard, the squat, and the jail. And this is actually the larger sort of overarching point of the book. So in the simulated cities database presented in the book and soon will be available online as the first publicly accessible geolocated database of these sites, allows us to better understand the urban and architectural forms that are commonly targeted, deemed suspect, or even criminal. So we can identify familiar forms amongst the urban clusters and outliers that generally align with informality or self-settled environments. Whoops, too quickly. So our databases reveal that the architectural designs are actually copied with only slight variations on multiple installations. So we gain the ability to actually identify each building type and its prevalence across the widespread geography. So you're seeing prisons here and dumps. And an intentionally repetitive and predictable assembly of urban forms and architectural types and material systems are deployed throughout the geography of simulation, and this is by design. So as we've seen, a large number of secretive urban simulation sites have propagated and evolved over the last several decades. All signs suggest that this shadow urbanism will only continue to spread. These sites are more than just a collection of urban simulacra. They are spatial mechanisms for exerting state power. From this position on the simulated sites, a militaristic viewpoint of our collective urban futures is continuously absorbed, rehearsed, and ingrained, and what is really scary, threatening to project back into the world and shape the cities, our cities in its image. Thank you. You can follow us through all these things.
You have a business card for that?
No, it's too much info.
Need at least 3.
That was fantastic. Thank you both so much. We have some time for questions, and I imagine there will be some. For me, at least, I like to think of myself as still new to CCA, but that is no longer the case, but I will still continue to believe it. I think there's aspects in the work that you do that certainly resonate with the work that's happening in the School of Architecture here, in our labs, the Urban Works Agency, Architectural Ecologies Lab. But the Fronts book, I think is such an amazing document. So I was lucky enough to be able to read it for some work that I had to do maybe about 6 months ago. Just as you're presenting it now, and I think one of your last comments, Ersela, was like, these operations will begin to flow back into the cities as, like our cities, right? Like not developing world cities, but the places that we inhabit every day. Have you done any research into how police departments, are their operations in simulated training sites? Obviously, increasingly, the American police are militarized, and are these sort of, training operations winding their way back towards us?
Right. Yeah. The most direct example we found is the Border Patrol training, which kind of needs to simulate certain conditions for kind of the use of lethal force. But what we've seen also are what the military has called kind of unfortunate coincidences. So during Black Lives Matter protests in the first wave in St. Louis, many years ago, the military actually was essentially showed up in downtown St. Louis for a training exercise without really warning anyone while the protests were happening, and so their PR campaign, stated that this might have been a kind of a mistake or an overlap, but we've also seen a lot of the sort of the DHS overreach into helping the policing during Black Lives Matter protests this summer with drone surveillance systems and kind of aerial imagery, and kind of gathering information. And so there seems to be more and more, the overlap seems to be a lot more visible, and also unapologetic.
And it seems after the events of January 6th that it's also American cities as sites for, I mean, how do we describe them? You know, like domestic disturbance. Jeanette Kim, do you want to unmute Jeanette and you have a question?
Hey, yes. My question is definitely related to Keith's as well. And thank you so much for this lecture. I'm really excited by your work. And I was just curious to hear about what kinds of military strategies are evolving in relationship to some of these mock-up urban sites. Like, for example, you know, is there an idea about like, does the concept of fronts as something which divides this area from that area, is that consistent with all of the different kinds of cities that they're imagining? Or is there perhaps even an idea of like a privatized zone or a walled compound, or like how is the kind of spatial context of the city influencing military strategy and vice versa?
Yeah, I think the biggest transformation is, at least according to current doctrine and kind of trajectories, if you read the military documents and blogs and things like that, is that conflict will increasingly be in megacities, like super high density environments, super vertical, super complex three-dimensionally, and super complex in terms of the ability to sense and act on spatial and material information. So there's also a kind of direction in the strategy and kind of the tactical efforts that they're evolving to increasingly think like beyond the visual and the auditory and the kind of even the olfactory kind of senses that they've been testing for a long time on these sites. Like some of these sites, for instance, have like smell generators and things like that that they think are incredibly important to simulate the like the intensity and the kind of chaotic nature of the senses as you enter complex urban or kind of peri-urban environment. But that's shifting to kind of broaden, like literally broaden the spectrum. So they're thinking beyond the visual spectrum, for instance, and they're talking about sort of multispectral capabilities of looking at cities as if they are seen by and through like infrared and radio wave frequencies and things like that, not only from a sophisticated, let's say Western or at least, you know, US military standpoint, but also from the kind of counter well, from whoever the US is occupying or addressing in these cities, from like a less equipped adversary. So like their conception of cities is like much more complex spatially and much more complex in a kind of like sensory mode. They're also adapting their training and building on these sites increasingly like subterranean kinds of situations. So a lot of these sites have had and continue to build things like subways and like tunnel systems that move from like a municipal building or an embassy out to the outside of the compound or something like that. But a lot of the current training is thinking about much more extensive sort of subterranean networks for one reason or another. I think there's a lot of talk about how that might be applicable in a North Korean theater of war or something like this. But it's just, I don't know, just from an architect or an urbanist perspective, I think it's like it's thickening in a lot of different directions, sort of simultaneously, and that's really shaping these sites and shaping like what's at stake and what's maybe targeted and maybe capable of producing a kind of lethal force.
And while there is a sort of an increased information warfare, they still, the mantra boots on the ground is still really important. You know, you could, the US bombs whatever location it it deems necessary, but then you have to have boots on the ground to hold that position. Otherwise, it doesn't make a difference. And so they have architects, or they have designers within the ranks who are in the field reporting back in the material matter of the buildings. Some of the sites we've visited and the people we've interviewed even speak about like hinges and window frames, because they need explosions to resist in a really realistic way, and things to blow up in a certain way that they are as close to the physical in the way that these buildings were made as possible. But they also talk about, I think there's a part in the book where we talk about postmodernism and facades. They also talk about the sort of in order to understand a building, you have to see it from behind, because the fronts are so fake that some of these facades are really not necessarily projecting the floor plans. And so troops are no longer able, like a modernist plan would be amazing because they would be able to read the floor plan in their minds, but these sort of fake fronts have allowed for, or have actually necessitated them reading, deconstructivism and Bernard Schoening, and they read DeLanda, and they look at swarming, but also this idea of like looking at a building from the back is the most honest way to establish its architecture is pretty just incredible.
Maybe that's a sequel, and the sequel will be called Backs.
It's super fascinating. Who is it the Corps of Engineers that's like, who's designing and building these? Are there outside contractors that are brought in? What is the I guess what's the industry associated, or is there one at this point associated with the production of these sites? Or is it the military itself, like with architects and engineers in the service that are doing it?
Yeah, the Army Corps of Engineers is actually a huge force in this, and they're a huge force in the standardization of what's required and sort of designed on the site. So for the CACTF especially, there are kind of guidelines for a lot of the buildings, and then basically every new installation is put out to bid, and then there are certain companies that specialize or have a lot more experience in building these kinds of places that tend to get the same contracts. For other installations that aren't, that's the gold standard. That's at least currently that's the most rigorously designed and kind of codified installation. For other installations, it's kind of like on a base by base basis, where some local, even just like members of the service might be recruited to help build different facilities, or they might be working with the Army Corps but not under this kind of national design guideline kind of scenario.
Are there any other questions? I have a follow-up if there's not, but it's the least important of the potential questions in the room. We have comments. Amazing presentation. Very glad to have been taught by both of you. So that's Arantxa.
Thanks, Arantxa.
Hi, Arantxa. Thanks.
Here's a Joseph Becker. Joseph, you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, sorry, I'm trying to figure this out on my phone. Thank you both for your excellent presentation. I'm curious about architects and their moral obligation to either choose not to participate in this process or do something other than just bring the issues to our attention, and what is the architect's role?
Well, I think so. What we hope it's very apparent in the book, but we completely advocate against it. I think some of the things that have emerged are these more kind of nuanced questions about sort of the moral obligations, where tools and inventions are sort of used cross industry without truly interrogating its sources and its intentions. And so we mentioned the border wall patent. There are architecture firms who are civilians who are designing some of these spaces. And we imagine the same CAD blocks, right? Maybe translate or transfer from one project to the other. And so therefore you have this real blurring of civilian thinking versus military thinking. And so for us, it's become just more urgent to be able to investigate and unearth more of these either patents or these kinds of technologies that seem really facile, you know, build better, faster, cheaper. Who doesn't want that? You know, it's the Venn diagram of the three things that can never all three be, you know, prioritized. And so I think that like the boycotting of the tools because of their intentions seems to be just more important because they're becoming ubiquitous. So yeah, that's what I would read to that.
Yeah, and I think you know, we showed a lot of the work in the book to outline the kind of military's expertise in urban environments, but there's kind of a counterpoint in the book as well, sort of from the perspective of the developing world. You know, what communities are actually doing like as engagements with or alternatives to this rather oppressive and really problematic kind of sophisticated anti-urbanism, I guess, from the military's perspective. So I think, you know, as architects and maybe we'll say urbanists, you know, to promote other practices and to promote other practices that are aware of the ways in which they might be infiltrated, shaped, measured, or countered by some of these other mechanisms that we describe in the book. But
some of their tactical operations drawings in urban environments are just really eye-opening in the way that built form is drawn and then penetration is drawn. And so there's another project that we didn't discuss today, but we've been thinking a lot about a counter code, right? Like what is a counter code that we can advocate for that is opaque and it's impenetrable by sort of military logistics, and perhaps if we draw in their style, maybe there is a way to find that kind of that moment of resistance. So I think, yeah, I guess, yeah, maybe I'll add to my first thought that just boycotting is not enough, right? Like I think sort of rethinking how we code our cities is really important.
Do you, are you seeing, and I guess, are you looking at cities in the developing world, urbanized areas in the developing world? I would imagine to do this, you would need to look at places that are already conflict zones, to strategies like, you know, that are instantiated, like an urbanism of resistance in these places, right? Like, you know, are traps designed into the urbanism, you know, blind spot, you know what I mean?
Well, so the book is twice the size it is now. And so part of the second half was kind of a catalog around the world of 6 or 7 case studies that are modes of resistance, and in really just deep conversations with Ms. Mitch McEwen and Jesse Vogler, who kind of sort of were some of the readers and advised on the book. We ended up taking those out because then we were worried about broadcasting these kinds of measures, you know, that maybe they should be hidden and they should thrive in the way they are. But yeah, the developing world, especially zones of conflict, are the sort of the warfare kind of response is continuing to become more and more sophisticated, even or despite really lack of resources. So that's happening, but we didn't include any of that.
I mean, I can't help think of, you know, so like many early architectural treatises were really like military treatises, right? Basically, like, you know, how do you design and build a defensive space, right? How do you like defend a city? And counter to those were treatises on how do you like lay siege
Right.
to a city. It's just, I don't really, this is not a question, it's just an observation of that relationship between, you know, architecture has always existed in this relationship to, you know, I mean, I guess fundamentally this puts it in, you know, like the understanding relationship to property and power and control, you know.
Right. I mean, you've seen Palladio's drawings, right?
Yeah.
Just bodies and formation,
Yeah.
and then cities and geometries, and how the formation of bodies can penetrate those geometries. And then some of the battle formations were actually direct floor plans of some of the villas. So there's a direct translation of like sort of the arch kind of floor plan with it's pretty, yeah. And Vauban, right, who essentially drew the embattlements and then the ways to penetrate them again with these amazing territorial drawings of trenches. So architecture has had a really strong relationship with the idea of the defensible space, but also we're really kind of attracted to finding ways to kind of to overcome those defenses, and it seems to be around since the beginning of time.
Now here's a question, perhaps. No.
Great. I hope dinner's good.
What's for dinner?
This is recorded and this will be available on Scaffold, our website, so you can go back and watch it again, Charles. Are there any other questions, reflections, thoughts? I could go on all night. I won't burden people with that, with my observations on this, but as you mentioned architecture there, and you showed a few projects in relation to the research that you're doing. So maybe to move us away from fronts, could you maybe speak a little bit about how architectural projects, so now I'm talking about like literally you're making a kind of spatial formal material proposition in relation to the research that you've been doing, like what the kind of hinge is there between like looking and acting for you, and maybe tucked into that question. And I think the ultraviolet shade project, I can't remember if that's the title, but that wasn't the slide that you had. You know, you begin to propose some kind of shade mechanisms, right, to ameliorate the conditions that you were mapping. But there's also a kind of didacticism in your projects too, right? Like you're trying to also like communicate the data that you're uncovering, make it visible through the work. Sometimes that visualization is through visualization itself and like non-architectural. Well, I would say those are still architectural means, but non-constructed means. And in other cases, you move towards, you know, construction as that operation. I'm just curious because like, you know, it's particularly for our students, like I just spent a really wonderful hour with our thesis students and they're all like, God bless them, like I think to a project or like activist kind of projects, right? Like projects grounded in a desire to actually look carefully, understand clearly, and act, you know, convincingly in the world.
Yeah, I think we realize that policy makers and activists are just much better and better trained at doing the sort of the policy lobby work. And so what we truly believe in is to respond with an architecture to these issues of injustice. And so if any of our projects stays in the research or publication level where it's really borrowing from kind of policy and social work and activism language, it just seems like then it would be trapped in kind of like dabbling or dilettantism. And so then we say, okay, what is our expertise in this project? How do we use our tool sets to be architects with it? And so we're never really interested in sort of leaving questions unanswered, and then the desire is to answer them with physical constructs with an architecture, because we're still designers and love making. But I think the so what question for us becomes like a question for design.
and especially with the public projects. So like you're looking at some pieces of, one of our installations behind us, the selfie wall, and with the shade project, I think, especially for the public projects, like the idea of an architecture or an urban space having the capacity to present itself and to present the environment around it in a way to a new public, sort of in real time, in space, so that that public can one, benefit from it, but two, sort of see or understand their environment or their relationship with their environment or their relationship to each other in a different way. I think like that's the task, or that's the part of the task of architecture that I think we're interested in when the work becomes constructed, right? Like how can we serve those moments that are made real by being spatial, by being constructed? Like how can we engage, the people, like the public, in a way that tunes them to something that they might not have previously considered, or that might be latent or less than visible, but still really impactful on them as people, or on their health, or on their bodies, or things like this, right? So I think that's sort of the agenda for the public work, or part of the method of the public work is to make that. I think you saying didactic, right? I think that's a good word for it. How can the construction of a space also, feed the construction of a public, or the construction of a new identity or a new understanding of the relationship of a public to an environment? Those are the questions we're always asking, and hopefully answering in some of the questions.
I think absolutely. There's so many audiences for the work that you do. There's the audience of experts, which might, I imagine, be like the tools that you develop being delivered as tools to other experts to utilize in their, locales, or their places. There's the public audience, and you were just, I think, speaking really, clearly about like your ambitions there. I think there's maybe public audiences that might be audiences that you would reach in print or on the web or in some other way, maybe, more broadly with some other impact than perhaps you were able to through an a built proposal, a built project. But I want to ask an interesting question now, because you were so emphatic there about the kind of public projects, Stephen. Like, are you capable any longer with what you've uncovered and what you know about the kind of, machinations that produce, like kind of political and, financial, like machinations that produce our environments, of taking on a private project as architects? Like, what do you do? Like, are you capable of having the innocence to just like, build a house for somebody? I mean, that's, maybe a bad example, but you know what I mean, right? Like, because I know that you do have projects like that too, or you have.
Right. We increasingly kind of have been walking away from projects like that, because I think we're really have become more and more invested in just the work, like uncovering injustices and really trying to kind of to broadcast as much as possible. And so in that way, the scale of a private object might not really serve our objectives, but we've had a few private projects that really either align with the way we think, or we've been lucky enough to kind of to work with a client and to bring up, to just like completely risk losing a project to just bring up our mapping and talk about scarcity and food deserts and inequality, and see whether the client responds or not. And so we've had one relatively younger client who has responded really well and kind of is like-minded. And so those kinds of synergies are very rare to come by. And then we've had other projects that we just walk away from because either we don't agree with, or it just there's so much work to do that our time really needs to be spent, or we want to spend it in the things that matter to us anyway. So yeah, it's become increasingly difficult to do that.
Okay.
And we're also incredibly privileged that we have, you know, positions at a university. And so we probably would be saying yes to a lot more if our livelihoods depended on that income, you know, but
Right.
so we're super privileged and lucky to be able to say no.
Yeah, these jobs that we have allow us to focus on the things that, you know, drive us and that interest us. So absolutely, I agree, Ursula. Like the privilege of that is not to be ignored, you know, or taken for granted. Are there any last questions for Ursula and Steve? This has been like such a wonderful night. It's just so great to have you both here. So many of your students have come to CCA and like, you know, just done amazing work, brought new ideas from Texas and from El Paso to, you know, keep things fresh for us. Have been great partners, I know, with the directors of our labs, great colleagues and classmates to their fellow students. So I want to thank you for the work that you're doing as teachers down there. That sounds weird down there, but it is, I suppose, down there. And also for the work that you shared with us tonight, the work you're doing actually to sort of lay bare some of the operations that are shaping our world and making it less safe, I think, and less equitable. And in doing so, allowing us to conceptualize ways and act in ways that maybe make it more just and more equitable in the future. So my great appreciation for you as architects and researchers, and of course, my deepest appreciation for you as like friends.
Great. Thank you so much for having us. And thank you for all these amazing supporting words. And it's just, I think for us, the biggest compliment is that all our former students are here in the room, you know, that they're not getting credit for this, but they still want to attend. They still want to hear us talk. So that's huge. So we love all you guys who are in here. And yeah, thank you for having us and for all the questions.
Yeah, thank you all.
Great to see you both.
Good
Good night,
you.
everybody.
Good night.